It used to be more popular in my parents' generations, where the whole family would, pack up for the day and go to one cemetery and spend the whole day, or go to several during the day. And there used to be a lot more families that you'd see in the graveyards. But unfortunately, generations later, we don't have as much connection to the graves, and so we don't see that as much.
She has dedicated her life's work to something mostly associated with death, but she doesn't see it that way, because to her, graveyards give us a fascinating view into people's lives. That's Nanette Napoleon on Long Story Short.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, produced with Sony Technology, is Hawaii's first weekly television program produced and broadcast in HD. High definition, it's in Sony's DNA.
Aloha mai kako, I'm Leslie Wilcox. In this edition of Long Story Short, you'll meet a vivacious, athletic, upbeat person who, from the job she created for herself, may seem obsessed with death. Nanette Napoleon is considered Hawaii's leading expert on graveyards. A trustee of Oahu Cemetery in Nu'uanu, she's the author and photographer of a book on Hawaii's oldest public graveyard. She gives walking tours of the site, and she supervised documentation of more than 300 graveyards and 30,000 tombstone inscriptions throughout the state. Because of her preoccupation and profession, one might suspect that this Kailua High School graduate had grown up a gloomy, isolated child. Absolutely not. Not true at all.
I was born in Kailua, and then when I was 2, my family moved to Alameda, California. My father went to work for Matson, and we stayed there for 8 years and then came back to Kailua. And then my father and his 2 brothers opened a Beach Boys stand in Waikiki next to the Moana Hotel. And then a few years after that, my dad started his own concession at the Halekulani Hotel.
Was that a family affair?
It really was. All of us, 6 kids, as we were growing up, as we got older, we all worked for my dad on the weekends, extra money. And when we weren't working, we were there anyway because we just wanted to go to the beach and surf and sail and play around and have a good time.
When you finished high school, you did give it a shot working full-time with your dad on the beach.
I did. I thought I wanted to be a beach girl for the rest of my life because I really loved the beach and surfing and all that. And so right out of high school, I had no plans to go to college, and I went to work for my dad full-time. But after about 6 months, it started getting a little old for me. I wasn't active enough. I was used to doing it on weekends and holidays, summers, like that, and it was always very much fun, but I found out that doing it every day was a little bit different, and so I wanted to do a little bit more than that. And so I decided, after a year I spent on the beach, I decided to go to college. And I was the first one in my whole Napoleon line, I think, to go to college and graduate from college. So I went to a small college on Maui called Mauna Olu College.
And it was while you were at Mauna Olu that you discovered a fascination with graveyards.
That's right. That's what piqued my interest. One spring break, instead of coming back to Oahu, I stayed on the island, and several of us went on a backpacking trip. We hitchhiked to Hana, and then we walked from Hana all the way around the backside of the island to Makena, and then we hitchhiked back to the college. And it was a 3-day hike, 2 nights of spending the night. And the second night, it was kind of a blustery, rainy evening, coming dark. Darkness was setting, and we looked for a nice place to camp out. And we saw the ruins of this old church called Hui Aloha. We wanted to camp on the leeward side of the building to get out of the wind, but that's where the cemetery was. So we sat there and stood there and said, well, we want to get out of the wind, but do we want to sleep in the graveyard? So we debated, and we went, yeah, I'm cold. I want to, I don't care. So we ended up pitching our tent, not on the graves, but on the side. And throughout the night, all we did is tell ghost stories, because here we are in this graveyard. And then miraculously, this almost full moon rises out of Haleakala crater, and it was really a spectacular evening. The next day, as we're packing up, I started looking at the graves, and I noticed that a lot of them had fresh flowers on them. And here we had just hiked for 2 days to get to this place in a real rural area. I thought to myself, wow, somebody came all this way to leave fresh flowers on a grave. And I thought, wow, that's really something. And I started thinking for the first time in my young life, why do we have graveyards? Why do we need to do this for dead people? Why do people come and make this effort to go on the grave of a dead person? It wasn't like a bolt of lightning that hit me and all of a sudden I'm going to be this cemetery researcher person. But it started in my consciousness, and as I went around, I started just noticing graveyards here and graveyards there. And then the next thing I knew, I was walking into them and seeing what I could see. And the first thing that I realized after visiting several was that they're aesthetically very interesting places to look at, because I've always been, since high school, interested in photography. So I started going back to take pictures of the graveyards. And after a while, I started actually looking and reading the tombstones, and I realized that, wow, there's some interesting information here, and I saw some well-known names that, from history, Hawaiian history, and I thought, wow, these places are, pretty interesting, and they're kind of historical. So that piqued my interest, and then, I graduated from college, but I always had that interest, and I would always visit graveyards wherever I was, whatever island, if I traveled.
For years, Nanette kept her passion for cemeteries to herself. Then, at a chance meeting at a cocktail party, she discovered she was not alone in her interest.
And then I found out that one of the men in the group had lived on the East Coast, and that he had been interested in graveyards for many, many years. And so he and I kind of went off and sat on a couch and got into this long conversation about graveyards. And I thought, wow, this is great. It's the first time I ever met somebody like me who was interested in graveyards, right?
Because your friends and family had said what?
Everybody said, oh, that's weird, or isn't that kind of morbid that you have this interest, right?
And you didn't consider it morbid?
Not at all, not at all. So I would kind of not tell people sometimes because I didn't like the reaction that I got, right? But here was a guy who was as much into it as I was. And then he turned me on to the fact that, or told me about a group on the East Coast called the Association for Gravestone Studies, which is an international group of cemetery researchers, some academics and non-academics. And then I immediately wrote them and found out, wow, there's a whole group of us out there.
Nanette Napoleon had connected. She found her place in the world and soon delved into one particular cemetery in Nu'uanu as the centerpiece of her research.
And you did a book about Oahu Cemetery. Mm-hmm. Would that be your favorite cemetery?
It is, because it's visually the most stunning, and there's so many different kinds of markers to look at and to talk about. And plus, there are so many famous people from Hawaiian history. There are hundreds of famous people.
For example?
James Campbell, who came from Europe, and he as a carpenter, and he settled here and became fabulously rich as a sugar planter.
After buying land that everybody else thought was worthless, but he found out you could get water to it.
That's right, in the Eva Plain. And he brought in a special drill team because nobody had drill bits to drill through the hard coral rock after the soil, and nobody could irrigate out there. But he had brought in some technology, new technology that could drill and then hit water. And the land that he had bought for pennies was all of a sudden worth, many hundreds of dollars. So that's how he made most of his money.
And the man they call the father of baseball is buried there?
The father of American baseball is right here in Hawaii. And don't let anybody tell you it's Abner Doubleday, because
Alexander Cartwright?
Alexander J. Cartwright. And he came out here from New York. He had an interesting story. He and his brother in 1849 went west as
Gold Rush?
They rushed to California. They went broke like all of their friends. And then the brother went back across country, but Alexander decided to take the sea route. And so he got on a ship that was going to eventually get back to Boston. But that particular ship, like many did in those days, came out to Hawaii first and then went around the Horn. They picked up goods, dropped off goods. So his ship came to Hawaii. But when he got here, he was feeling pretty sick. So he said, okay, I'm going to stay in the islands till I get better and then get on another ship and go home. And he did. But he liked it here so much that when he got back to his home, he picked up his whole family and they immigrated to the islands.
There's one statue, it's a tombstone at Oahu Cemetery, where it's so different from all the rest, but on the other hand, it feels like it's in keeping. I believe it's a life-size statue of Duke Kahanamoku's sister.
Right, right. And I have that picture of it in my book. Her name was Mariah, spelt like Maria, but pronounced Mariah. And she was the baby of the family. There were 7 brothers and then her, the baby. And unfortunately, she was ill, sickly as a young adult, and she died when she was only in her mid-20s. But at the time of her death, she was betrothed to an Italian baron. And the baron was heartbroken. He went back to Italy. He took a picture of her and ordered a life-size statue of her to be carved in marble. And it was brought back and installed in the graveyard. That's the only life-size, full-body image of a person I've seen in Hawaii. But when I tour graveyards all around America, I see many, many more full-size bodies.
It seems as though cemeteries are the place where you find out people's histories, and in fact, aren't there some wonderful stories of how people died?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the tombstone actually explains sailors who went to the aid of their fallen friend
right.
and died themselves trying to rescue him.
That's right. Some of them say like fallen from the mast, you know, and they don't say drowned. They say, drowned whilst bathing. You know, taking a bath in the ocean water. And most of the sailors, people don't realize in that era, couldn't swim. So they had to have a rope tied around them and they would jump in the water, but sometimes they drowned doing that, or they fell off the mast, or it was such a dangerous profession in the storms, the big blocks of tackles and ropes and things, you know, would swing around and they'd hit somebody in the head, kill them. So it was a very dangerous profession. And in the 1800s, you couldn't keep a body on a ship because there's no refrigeration and bring them home. So they all had to be buried at sea. But then the next port the ship landed at, the fellow sailors would go out and buy a tombstone for their fallen sailor shipmate and erect it in the local cemetery and say, this is on such and such day to commemorate their passing.
There are a lot of different areas of Oahu Cemetery. Mm-hmm. Some are ethnic. And some,
religious.
Aren't there some Civil War differentiations too?
Oahu Cemetery is the only cemetery that has a Civil War plot. It's called listed as the Grand Army of the Republic plot, or the GAR. And these were veterans of the Northern Army, Marines, and Navy veterans who survived the Civil War and went about their lives and ended up in Hawaii and settling in Hawaii and died in Hawaii. And after the war, the veterans formed a veterans organization called the GAR, which actually became a very prominent political group in America in general. So they started a branch of the GAR in Hawaii, and those guys that were veterans joined, and part of their dues went to buying a plot in Oahu Cemetery so that when they died, they could be buried together.
What about Confederates?
No Confederates. That was only for the Northern forces, this particular plot. But there are other Civil War Confederates buried in the cemetery, a few.
Among the many aesthetic riches found in cemeteries is a very specialized photographic process. As Nanette Napoleon points out in her book on Oahu Cemetery, tombstone photos bring the dead to life for the casual viewer.
If I do another book, it'll be about those porcelain portraits because I love them. And they're very important actually for families because in those days, the regular person didn't have cameras. Cameras weren't even invented till 1860s. So the average person didn't have them. So if you wanted a photo, you had to go to a studio and pay for a photograph. So families did that, and then when somebody died and they went to the funeral parlor and they wanted one of those, they had to bring a family photo in, give it to the mortician. They would send it off to the mainland. There was only a few places on the mainland who did it. They would take a picture of the picture, and with that negative, then expose that negative onto that piece of porcelain, which is chemically coated with photographic chemicals. So you expose it onto that, and it goes on there as a picture. And because it's on porcelain, and you put it up there, it lasts, sometimes I've seen them as old as 100 years old.
We have Oahu Cemetery, which is, I mean, I love the wrought iron and the shape of the tombstones, but there are others that are tucked away in places where today you wonder, why would they put a cemetery there? But of course, Hawaii has changed, and you wouldn't put a cemetery next to an on-ramp of a freeway, but that's what we have, right?
On-ramps of freeways, in the middle of a parking lot at Windward Mall, in the backside, there used to be St. Anne's Church located in that spot. The church moved across the street, and that lot was abandoned for many, many years, and the church eventually was torn down, but the graveyard that was associated with the church remained at that location, even though it was all grown over and everything. But then in the 70s, was it, they were going to build Windward Mall, and they were going to first bulldoze it over, but some people in the community, including myself, petitioned that, and we said, no, save the cemetery. So they did, and they cleaned it up and put a fence, white picket fence
It's in the back lot of the shopping center parking lot.
Yeah, and you park right next to it and everything.
Isn't that where Kau'i Zudermeister is buried?
Kau'i Zudermeister is over there. Who else? One of the more interesting ones from that graveyard is a couple of men who, on December 7th, 1941, were one of 65 civilians who died as a result of the attack on Oahu. A lot of people don't realize that that attack not only happened at Pearl Harbor and Hickam, but throughout our island, Oahu Island, and that there were actually civilians who had no connection with Pearl Harbor or any of the military bases that were killed. And there are two buried in that cemetery who were relatives who worked at Pearl Harbor, both of them. And they heard on the radio, this is not a drill, and they called for all the people who worked at Pearl Harbor to report to your stations. So it was 4 men who got in a car, and they were all related, and all from the windward side. They got into this black sedan. That's how they went to work every day. They went over the pulley, came down the pulley, and then they were going over the hill in Aleva Heights. And right in the middle of the intersection, an American anti-aircraft shell came and fell and hit them directly on the top of the car. So it hit the car, and all 4 men were killed.
Knowledge of the incident led Nanette Napoleon to uncover more stories of civilian deaths in the December 7th attack.
And there were 2 markers of 2 little girls, young girls, and with the same last name and the same death date, December 7th, 1941. And I said, okay, wait a minute. I don't think, unless they were killed on the same day in a car crash or something, something's going on here. So I called up the historian at the Pearl Harbor, and I asked him, were there anything about civilians who died on December 7th? So, yeah, we have some information, and they're in these boxes over here.
It wasn't a ready-made report, not at all.
No. So I said, can I come and look at that? So he allowed me to do that, and I instantly got interested in this story. And for a number of years, I've been collecting data about them, who they were, exactly who they were, how old they were, where they were, how they died.
And nobody had done that before?
Nobody had done that, not even the Pearl Harbor guys. They had all this data, but they hadn't put it together. So I was the first one to kind of do that. And then comes the year of the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And I wanted to do something to commemorate those civilians. I made a trip to Senator Akaka's office. I wrote him ahead of time, and I said, is there anything we can do about these civilians? As a result of that, he generated a resolution to acknowledge those civilians.
You are known for having picnics at Oahu Cemetery just to enjoy the rural charm in the park-like setting, and to honor folks, to feel at home there. And I thought of you when one Memorial Day I went to Valley of the Temples, where my grandmother is buried, and there was several large families with picnic chairs, and they had hibachis, and they had Subway sandwiches, and they were playing music, and it was the most natural, warm, wonderful thing.
That's right.
I'd seen at a cemetery. It was just people were at home with their loved one, and they were actually telling stories, and it was as if the person buried there, or whose spirit was still around could hear.
Yeah, and I love that about Hawaii. It's probably the only place in the United States where people do that, because there's a long history in doing that. And it comes from the Hawaiian culture, where Hawaiians remember the family grave sites, and they put makana gifts at the grave sites. And that has sort of been adopted by other cultures. And it used to be more popular in my parents' generations, where the whole family would, pack up for the day and go to one cemetery and spend the whole day, or go to several during the day. And there used to be a lot more families that you'd see in the graveyards. But unfortunately, generations later, we don't have as much connection to the graves, and so we don't see that as much. But as part of my mission is the reason why I've developed walking tours and lectures. I want to see people get more connected back the way they used to be, connected to the graveyards, and do those kind of family things, so that our generations below us will remember and pay tribute to the ancestors.
You see the most interesting things left on gravestones. For example, can you give me some of the more unusual ones you've seen, besides the orange that Asian families often leave?
Well, the orange is actually for specific ethnic groups. That's for either Chinese or Japanese.
Not Koreans.
Not so much Korean.
Japanese or Chinese?
More Chinese
Okay.
and Japanese, Okinawan. And that has to do with Bon season and Buddhist ritual of they call it feeding the hungry ghosts. So you go to the family grave site to pay homage to your ancestor. You leave foods to feed the hungry ghost, because if you don't, then the ghost can turn to an angry ghost and can do bad things to the living. So that's why you must do that. And then food stuff, incense, you burn incense to awaken the spirits. And that's sort of like a calling card saying, okay, we're here. And they smell the incense. They know you're there. And then you do your ceremonies. And then at the end, you burn firecrackers to chase away any angry spirits around the area and keep the place sacred.
You get a sense of what a person was like sometimes. I know this one place where I always see a can of a certain kind of beer, and there's cigarettes.
Cigarettes, candy, if it's a child, toys, little toys if it's children. Right?
Or a pinwheel sometimes.
A pinwheel, lots of pinwheels.
I read a book recently where one of the smallest self-governing states in the world, in the Pacific, Niue, they have these family graveyards, and you always put something that reminded you of the person there or their favorite possession, and so there, a number of the women have sewing machines on their graves.
Yes. I've not heard about that one. Oh, that's cool. I'd like to get a picture of that.
What are the rules? I mean, there are people who say, oh, that's, you don't be stepping near the gravestone, and what are you doing being so curious? Are you not supposed to step on the gravestone? Are you, what's not proper?
That's a good question, and what I tell people when I go on tours, because they always ask me that, is that it's dependent upon your culture. That every culture, be it Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, all have different beliefs on the afterlife, about death and dying rituals. So what I tell people is that whatever you come from, whatever tradition you come from, that's what's right for you. If somebody else has something different, like your family may say, oh, we don't step on graveyards because you're interfering with the spirits or something.
Or don't eat lunch over there.
Yeah, don't eat lunch, don't wear something.
Don't play your happy music.
Yeah. So it just depends on what you learn from your culture. Yeah. And nothing is more right or wrong than anything else. Everybody is valid.
When I hear you talking about cemeteries, I hear you talking about the history of Hawaii and what a cemetery can tell you about what people did in life.
Right.
And that's the attraction for you?
That's the attraction for me, and I like to pass that on, because a lot of people just think of cemeteries as just simple repositories for the dead, okay, some place to bury the dead. But who are they for more? Are they more for the dead, or are they more for the living? In my mind, they're more for the living. They're a place that we can physically go to connect us with our ancestors. Some people don't need that connection, that physical connection, but most people in our Western culture need that, and most cultures around the world. That's why almost every single culture has some kind of burial ground of some kind. Not all, but most.
If you had to describe to people and make them really understand what your joy in this is, what is it?
I get a lot of joy from the physical way that cemeteries look and how they feel. They're very peaceful, park-like settings, and some people have a hard time. They say, oh, I'd never lived next to a graveyard, or they don't like just wandering around the graveyard. They'll go there for a funeral or something, then they kind of dig out of there. But for me, it's really relaxing, and it transports me back in time. And when I'm in particularly like Oahu Cemetery, I just go blank, and I'm like in this other world in the 1800s all the time. And it's fascinating for me, you know.
So the next time you're in a cemetery, pay attention to the little details. The doors into the past left slightly ajar, beckoning you to enter a different world. They're not necessarily spooky or morbid places. It all depends on your perspective. I hope you've enjoyed this half hour of Nanette Napoleon's refreshing perspective. For Long Story Short and PBS Hawaii, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Ahui ho kako.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox is produced in HD by PBS Hawaii with Sony technology. High definition. It's in Sony's DNA.
What else have you seen on gravestones?
You know, we talked about Alexander Joy Cartwright, the baseball guy. For many years now, people who know baseball, they make special pilgrimages to his grave, and they will put baseballs signed by them, or little league teams will go, and will say from the Pearl City Little League team, and dated and everything. And I find, and all the balls are still there, and sometimes bats, baseball cards, baseball caps. I remember touring some graveyards during a cemetery conference, and we went to the gravesite of Joe DiMaggio, and he had all kind of baseball, memorabilia stuff.